Hey everybody. So again, sorry that I'm not there, but I am very much not feeling okay. So I'm going to try to keep this as quick as possible, get through as much as I can here. But we're going to get a jump on Unit 5. And Unit 5 is all about revolutions. So that's going to be a bunch of different ones, and we'll talk about them all. So um, first off, when it comes to all of the different revolutions, it is important to realize that colonies have been formed just about everywhere. And we'll talk about colonization and other things like that in a little bit. But essentially, Europe has conquered everywhere, right? So as you can see, you've got Great Britain with colonies all throughout Africa, Australia, Asia, Canada, the United States until, well, their revolution. But France also has colonies in Africa, and they also have a little bit of stuff here and there. You'll notice though Spain and Portugal basically fell off the map. They no longer are going to have very many colonies. They're not going to play much of a role later on. So we'll talk about why that is too. Now, in terms of the timeline here, we are bumping forward in the timeline, and everything that we're going to talk about is going to be from 1750 all the way to 1900. So we're getting into a little bit more modern times. We're getting into all the different revolutions, but most importantly here, you need to realize that all of the major key things that happen during this time period are all going to start essentially with the American Revolution. It's the first one that kind of kicks things off. And so, because of that, it kind of spurns on some different ideas, thoughts, and other things. So, American Revolution is going to be first. Then, after that, is going to be the French Revolution. And then you're also going to have things like the Haitian Revolution and the Latin American revolutions, but also things like the Industrial Revolution. That's going to matter more than even, I would argue, any of the actual colonies forming their own revolution. So here's what's going on in all these different places. So in order to figure out why these people are going to have a revolution is, well, the Enlightenment. So if the Renaissance was the light at the end of the Dark Ages, the Enlightenment is the final bringing of ideas and light into the world when it comes to government. So the Renaissance was all about science, art, and kind of those general practices, whereas the Enlightenment is going to be mainly about government. So here are some quotes from some different people. These are going to be important people. You're going to have to kind of talk about them for your assignment today. So make sure you pay attention to it here. So Thomas Paine has a quote, "In America, the law is king," which is kind of important because you'll notice he doesn't say that any person is the king. George Mason, that all men are by nature equally free and independent. It's a big deal. Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Well, he didn't really view African American people as equal, but he did come up with that idea, right? John Locke says no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So kind of a peaceful approach to things. Voltaire says all morals are equal. It is not their birth, but virtue that makes the difference. Dennis Diderot says the good of the people must be the great purpose of government. Rousseau, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. And then Immanuel Kant, enlightenment is man's leaving his self-caused immaturity. And then the last one, Montesquieu. There is no liberty if the judiciary power be not separated from the legislative and executive, which is going to be the separation of powers that we're going to talk about with him. So the people that matter the most are going to be these guys right here. We'll talk about more of them, but these are the big ones. So to understand them, we need to think like them.
What is the purpose of government? Imagine a time before kings, presidents, or prime ministers, before the formation of society and civilization. This is what philosophers call a state of nature. In this thought experiment, people lived freely, without rules or formal laws.
Yeah, so the state of nature is people living without rules or laws that are enacted by other people. It is simply the state of people existing without any sort of government. So along comes Hobbs, and he's the one with the wild whisker mustache. So his quote is up here, but the big deal about him is in red here, and it says that this is the generation of that Leviathan to which we owe our peace and defense. So he essentially comes up with the idea, um, and that's the Leviathan, by the way, which seems kind of crazy, but it's based on a work of fiction. Um, and he says that humans exist in a primitive state of nature. Humans consent to be governed for self-protection, that we give up some of our rights in order to be safe from the Leviathan.
But what exactly does this state look like? For 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes, the state of nature is a war of all against all. Mankind's basic nature is fear, insecurity, death, and turmoil. And from this constant terror, people decided to surrender some basic rights to a sovereign entity, or what he called the Leviathan. If one was, say, fed up with the theft of his potions, the state could pass laws to protect his goods or help him receive some sort of reparation. This protection is important for a number of reasons, but the most significant is that laws and their enforcement keep constant anxiety at bay.
Right. So essentially, he comes up with the idea that people will give up some of their rights to the government as long as it means that the government will protect them and keep them safe. So he viewed the Leviathan as this kind of large, necessary evil, if you will. Then comes John Locke. And John Locke is probably the one that gets quoted the most out of all of these thinkers. And that's mainly because he's real influential on American history. So he says that all mankind, being equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his life, liberty, or property, thus being a reason for having government. Right? So he says that people are sovereign and they consent to the government for protection of their natural rights. So natural rights is going to be a big deal there, and you'll see that in our Constitution. So that's why he kind of gets referenced quite a bit. Then there's Montesquieu. Montesquieu says, in every government there are three sorts of power: the legislative, executive, and the judicial. When the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or same body, there can be no liberty, lest the same person or body should enact tyrannical laws and execute them in a tyrannical manner. So he literally comes up with the idea of the separation of powers. That's going to be a big deal for every government ever. And he says that essentially if all of the power in the legislative and the executive, so making the laws and carrying them out, are handled by the same person, then you're going to have tyranny. You can never have a open democracy if only one person is making all the laws and also executing all of the laws as well. And he says that the best form of government includes a separation of powers. And then Rousseau comes along, and he very much agrees with the same general concept and takes it just a step a little bit further. He says that every law the people is not ratified in person is null and void. It's in fact not a law. Man is born free, and yet we see him everywhere in chains. The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protection the whole common force, the person and the goods of each associate, which is really, really wordy and large to say that people are born free, but they choose to walk around in chains because they give up some of that freedom in order to be safe or in order to be just within the law. So he says that government is a contract between rulers and people, that you need to have a connection between the two of them, that it can't just be one or the other. So he is the one that kind of comes up with the people that give the power to the executive and the judges or the justice system now. And in return, they get security.
For 18th century Swiss-born French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the state of nature is rather different than that conceived by Hobbes. Rousseau sees natural man as independent, solitary, and peaceful. Rousseau thought people were much better off without government. With the creation of agriculture, private property, and the division of labor, however, came inequalities. Unequal access to resources created tension, enmity, and envy. People started to become aware of their limited material situation and lack of upward mobility. They became aware of their unfreedom. This led Rousseau to claim that man is born free and is everywhere in chains. While both philosophers describe the state of nature as a sort of beastly existence absent any morality, they disagree on some fundamentals. Rousseau sees the Hobbesian model as leading to despotism, in which people have no choice but to turn to a third party to secure basic needs. Consequently, they do not freely choose their leaders. Rousseau argues that rather than choosing leaders out of fear, people choose to give up some power and rights, at least so that citizens can be equal. Rousseau dictated that decisions ought to be made for the sake of everyone, instead of a few. This would require that people follow a rule of law that they would follow on their own anyway. For Rousseau, people are better without government, because society means unfreedom and oppression. Whether out of fear or for the sake of equality, the consent to be ruled is called the social contract. So, listeners, I ask, who has it right? Do people need to be kept in line, or should they remain free to do as they wish?
And that's kind of up to you to decide, right? So Rousseau has this idea that if government is in the way, then people won't be free, right? That people need that freedom. Whereas Hobbes had the idea that, well, no, people need the government to keep them in line and keep them safe, because if there are no laws, people will naturally kill each other. And Rousseau took the opposite approach, where he was like, no, people naturally are good. They wouldn't do that at all. And then comes Voltaire. It does not require great art or magnificently trained eloquence to prove that Christians should tolerate each other. I, however, am going further. I say that we should regard all men as our brothers. What? The Turk, my brother? The Chinaman, my brother? The Jew? The Siam? Yes. Without doubt, are we all not all children of the same Father and creatures of the same God? So Voltaire is the first major theologian to come up with the idea that all men are actually created equally, regardless of where they're from. It's not just Christians that should be treated equally, it's everyone. He also came up with the idea of religious toleration and thought that everyone should essentially have the ability to practice their own religion, because they all still are created from the same being. And that's it. So those are the major thinkers that are there. During class today, feel free to look up extra information about them in order to answer the questions that are on Canvas. But there are 5 questions for you to answer, and your assignment is due by midnight on Monday. I'll have the next video for you tomorrow, which is going to be all about revolutions, mainly the American one first. So we'll cover that tomorrow, and I will talk to you guys later. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to send me a message on Canvas. I will answer it as soon as possible, but I am trying to kind of sleep a lot and try to kind of stay active and moving around when possible. So I may not answer it right away, but I will get to it whenever I can. I hope you guys all have a great day, and see you tomorrow.